One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and is the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. We are just about a week out from Christmas Day, and so early Merry Christmas to everybody who is listening. I appreciate you hanging out with me for the last year or so, or however long it is that you've been listening to the Inflammation Nation. So we are on part 6 of our discussion about longevity and health span. And I said in our last episode that we're going to talk about things like VO2 Max and zone 2 cardio. And as I was mapping out the comments that I wanted to share, the ideas that I wanted to share in this episode, I realized I've got to kind of spend some time talking about VO2 Max first, and we'll do a separate episode on zone 2 cardio and just different training styles and adaptations. But very quickly, last time we started talking about some of the top predictors of longevity. And I mentioned first and foremost that having a long-lived parent is quite advantageous because that does predict whether or not you have a chance of living to a long and ripe old age yourself. It, of course, doesn't guarantee it, but having a very elderly parent who has survived many, many years is actually a good sign. But a lot of your own longevity is tied up into your own choices, right? Diet, lifestyle, and how you interact with the environment. I also spent some time talking about mobility and balance and physical strength as predictors, not just of longevity, but quality of life. And it's probably a good time to remind you that the goal is not just to live longer, but it's to live longer better with a better quality of life, meaning that you want to be older, but you also want to maintain your physical capacity. You want to be mentally and emotionally capable. And of course, you want to be independent and be able to take care of yourself. And that reminds me of that Ashley Montague quote that I've mentioned several times. The idea is to die young, as old as possible. And I gave some simple testing strategies, things you can use at home just to check yourself, like check your balance, check your basic strength, etc. So today I'm going to throw my hat into the ring and talk about this next great predictor of longevity, and that is this thing called your VO2 max. And I say throw my hat into the ring because it seems like everybody and their mother is talking about VO2 max and zone 2 and zone 5 training these days, as if these things are new, and they're certainly not. But like many things in the sphere of health and wellness, things become in vogue and then they fade and then they get rediscovered a decade or two later, and everything old seems like it's brand new again. And things like VO2 max and fitness and concepts of zone 2 and high intensity interval training all fall into that category because these have been around for quite a long time. So let's start with VO2 max. What is VO2 max? If you've not heard of this before, it's a measure of the maximum amount of oxygen that you can take into your lungs, distribute through your circulatory system by the pumping of your heart and the circulation of blood, as well as the delivery of oxygen to your cells, which then use that oxygen to create energy, or what we call ATP. And all of that happens inside your cell and uses something called the mitochondria, which I'm sure you've heard of the mitochondria before. And since your cells create carbon dioxide as a byproduct of using oxygen to make energy, the VO2 max test, it measures your exhaled carbon dioxide during exercise, which means that, let's say in the absence of heart and lung disease, your VO2 max tells us roughly how efficiently the mitochondria of your cells use that oxygen to produce energy as they burn different fuel sources. Now, you may have heard me or somebody else describe the mitochondria as the energy producing factory of your cells. They work best when you feed them oxygen plus some fuel source like glucose or fatty acids. And I say them and not it because almost every single cell, with the exception of your red blood cells, almost every single cell in your body has not just one mitochondria, but under healthy conditions, they contain thousands of them. Now, the name VO2 max itself tells you what it is. The V of VO2 max refers to volume. The O2 refers, of course, to oxygen, and the word max refers to how much you can take in. What's your capacity? How much can you take in? How much can you use? And VO2 max it can be expressed a couple of different ways, but one very commonly way that this is expressed is in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. Now, I have listeners for the podcast all over the world, but most of my listeners are here in the States, so we're used to thinking in terms of not milliliters, but gallons and quarts, and we're used to talking about pounds, but in the scientific community, even in the United States, they use metrics. And so again, VO2 max, not metrics, but metric. So VO2 max is expressed in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight. And if you don't know how to make the conversion, a kilogram is 2.2 pounds. The math is very simple. So again, your VO2 max tells us how much oxygen your heart and lungs can take into your bloodstream, deliver to your cells to make energy using that oxygen, using predominantly fat as a fuel source. Now, that's not entirely true, but we'll talk about that as we continue on, perhaps in the next episode. So again, VO2 max also reflects the upper limit of your aerobic capacity, where your body must switch from using fat as a primary fuel source to using glucose. And that has important implications for things like metabolic flexibility and even translates to your response to things like low carb diets or intermittent fasting. The lower your VO2 max is, the more likely you have to use carbohydrates as a fuel source, the less tolerant you are to intermittent fasting and low carbohydrate diets. Now, for this episode, we're going to ignore all that. We're going to talk about VO2 max as a direct measurement of cardiorespiratory fitness in the fullest sense of that term. And also, we're going to talk about it as an indirect indicator of longevity because VO2 max has very strong links to that concept of mortality or longevity. Several researchers have studied this link between VO2 max and longevity by looking at something called all-cause mortality. And this means that research studies are designed to take a group of people and study some behavioral characteristic over time, like VO2 max, for example, and make observations about how that thing being studied, VO2 max, affects something else, like dying from any or some specific cause. In the case of VO2 max and all-cause mortality, they've studied the fitness levels of different people and looked to see how many people in each level of fitness die of things like heart disease or cancer, stroke, diabetes, kidney disease, and so on over a period of time. And that might be a shorter period, like 3 to 4 years or 5 years. It might be a longer period, like 8 to 10. In one study published in 2018 in the medical journal Cardiology, it's very clear that lower levels of fitness, as measured by the VO2 max, are associated with significantly increased risk of dying from any and all causes in a 10-year period of time. In that study, they looked at approximately 122,000 people, and they followed them for close to 10 years. And they did what's called an age and gender match studies, which basically means that they compared a 55-year-old man to a 55-year-old man and not a 28-year-old woman, for example. So they were comparing apples to apples, so to speak. And at the extremes of low fitness compared to elite fitness levels that you might see in professional athletes, they found that individuals with the lowest VO2 max were 5 times more likely to die of any cause as compared to someone of the same age and gender who had an elite fitness level. Or to say it another way, improving your VO2 max, your ability to take in and use oxygen from low levels to elite levels, means that you can reduce your risk of dying in the next 10 years or so by an astounding 80%. Now, if that doesn't make you sit up and pay attention, you may as well turn me off right now. You may as well just stop listening because this is significant. It's very important, and this relates directly to you, your health, your quality of life. But it also tends to beg some questions. Like you might be thinking, well, do I really have to train like an elite athlete to reduce my risk of dying? And the answer is no. It would be great if you did, but the answer is no. You don't have to go to that extreme. And sometimes incremental changes can translate into significant outcomes. In fact, the additional risk reduction going from an above average VO2 max to an elite status is kind of negligible in the big scheme of things. So you don't necessarily need to shoot for elite status, but regardless of your age and gender, you should be shooting for above average. The biggest changes, according to the study, actually come from when someone goes from low VO2 max fitness levels to high levels. But that doesn't mean that simply going from low VO2 max to below average isn't worth the effort. It certainly is. Again, better yet, your goal should be to achieve above average VO2 max for your age and for your gender. I would say that that is the sweet spot where you balance the amount of time and effort that you have to put into your fitness and what you get out of it. But it requires you to know three things at the start: where you are now, what your goal is, and of course, how to get there. And we'll cover all of those as we go through. Now, you may have heard people say that, you miss 100% of the targets that you never aim for or shoot at. And so it's not enough to simply go to the gym, hop on a treadmill, go outside for a walk, or even join a gym and spend 3 or 4 or 5 days a week there just doing stuff. It's not enough to just do stuff. You have to be intentional and you have to be consistent, which means that there's a certain amount of programming or forethought that you will need to put into improving your status of your VO2 max and reducing your risk. So let me throw some numbers at you from the study in cardiology, just to give you an idea of how tightly linked your VO2 max capacity is and the risk for or the reduction of all-cause mortality. For example, in this study, going from low VO2 max to above average reduces your all-cause mortality risk by about 55%. And going from low VO2 max to high VO2 max, which is above average, reduces your all-cause mortality risk by about 75%. And again, these numbers are astounding. They're significant, they're impressive, and it means that fitness is worth the effort. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, all that sounds good, but I don't have the time. And then you start to fill your head with all of the excuses as to why you can't or you don't exercise. And to that, I say, well, you know what I want to say, but I'm just going to say stop. Just stop. We all have the same 24 hours in a day. So why is it that some people who might be even more stressed and stretched in their lives than you are right now, and I'm not demeaning or diminishing whatever challenges you have in life, I'm just saying that there are people who are in the same state of living that you are that make the time to exercise. They make the commitment because it's important. And notice that I said that they make the time, not take the time. And so do me or do yourself a favor and honestly ask yourself, how much time do you spend every day on social media or binge watching Netflix or some other low value, long duration, non-productive activity? And ask yourself where and how you can reclaim, even if it's just 30 minutes a day, even if it's only 3 days a week. I know the time is there, and I know that you know too. You just need to think about it and shift your priorities. All right, let me get away from that. I want to go over some general guidelines here in a moment, but sometimes it might be helpful to understand how the VO2 max is measured, and we'll talk about how it's expressed or reported. And this falls under the category of knowing where you are. Like how do I know where I am? So the most accurate way to test VO2 max is using sophisticated equipment in a lab that, 10 years ago, you could probably only find in university exercise research or kinesiology labs. Some cardiology centers would have them. But now VO2 max testing, as well as tests for body composition, like a DEXA scan, for example, even things like basal or resting metabolic rate tests are starting to show up in local gyms and other outfits that are kind of really dialed into where the current research is about all of these connections. So you might be able to find a local outfit that will test your VO2 max for a fee. Just simply Google VO2 max testing near me, and you'll probably come up with some options, especially if you're living in larger metropolitan areas. And I've seen prices range from $150 all the way up to seven something, right? So there's going to be a range. It's going to depend on where you are. Now, the test is usually done on a treadmill or using a stationary bicycle, and it involves having a mask strapped tightly over your mouth and nose, and that mask is attached to a machine with hoses that measures the amount of carbon dioxide and oxygen that's being exhaled during exercise. And they compare that to how much oxygen and CO2 that we know is in room air, for example, right? And this machine performs some sophisticated calculations to determine how much carbon dioxide you're exhaling for the oxygen concentration that's coming into your system. And again, they can calculate several key metrics that I'm going to lay out here in a second. But for now, understand that when you're at rest and are at low levels of activity or exercise, you should be burning mostly fat as a fuel source and just a little bit of glucose or sugar, mostly fat. But as exercise intensity increases and the demand for energy goes up, there is a transition point where your body has to switch from fat burning to glucose or sugar burning in order to sustain the effort. And that's because your fat burning capacity can only fuel lower energy outputs. And the harder and more intensely you work, the more you're going to need the power that glucose provides that fat can't. And that's not to say that, since glucose burning provides more power, then it's better than fat burning as a primary fuel source. And, I've said before that you need the ability to burn both fats and glucose for fuel. That's what we call metabolic flexibility. What you need beyond the simple ability to burn fat and glucose equally well is the ability to stay in fat burning mode with higher levels of activity and exercise. And that happens when you increase your VO2 max and you train your cells, specifically your mitochondria, to use fat efficiently as a fuel source. And all of this is tied up in fitness training. So what can the VO2 max tell us? Well, first of all, for any given level of exercise intensity, it can tell us if you're a fat burner or a sugar burner, your primary fuel source. And remember that healthier and fitter people burn fat as fuel to a greater extent and longer than unwell and poorly conditioned people, even when they increase their exercise intensity. That's pretty important. The other thing a VO2 max test can tell us is when you hit that maximum amount of oxygen that you can take in and metabolize, that's your VO2 max. Sometimes we might call it the aerobic or the anaerobic threshold, and that's what we're primarily focused on today. It can also tell us about something called the lactate threshold, which is the exercise intensity and power output where you're burning glucose for fuel, but you can't handle the metabolic byproducts that are created by that, many of which are actually waste products that do limit your exercise capacity. So it's not like you can do an exercise like riding a bike or running on a treadmill and just simply increase your speed or the intensity ad infinitum. Like there is a limit to how much your physical body can do. And part of this is you're not able to handle the metabolic waste products produced by the higher energy output activity. Now, I said earlier that your VO2 max is typically expressed as milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. And there are kind of two interesting things that come out from VO2 max being expressed as a factor of body weight. The first is that it normalizes the data and allows you to compare your number to someone else's, generally speaking. So if, for example, you have a VO2 max that's measured at, say, 35 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute, and someone else has a VO2 max of 24, your 35 is higher than 24, that means you have a higher fitness level, and therefore we can assume less risk of dying from any cause in the next 8 to 10 year period, according to some of the research studies. But more important than knowing your score versus someone else's is that when you know your score, now you have a baseline to gauge your own progress, your own improvement from training, so that you can compare your score and your mortality risks today compared to 6 months down the road, compared to 12 months down the road, compared to 2 years down the road. And this is critical because, listen, VO2 max tends to peak in our 20s. If you're lucky, maybe your 30s, and it steadily declines as we age unless we take action, unless we take ownership of this, and unless we do something about it. Now, the second interesting thing about how VO2 max is expressed as a factor of body weight is that you can change it simply by losing weight, like without even doing any training for your heart and lungs at all. So think of it this way. Since your VO2 max reflects the capacity of your respiratory and cardiovascular systems to take in and deliver oxygen to every single cell in your body, the larger your body is, the more cells you have, and the more cells you have to distribute the same amount of oxygen across or to. If you reduce your body mass, that same amount of oxygen is distributed among fewer and smaller cells, which means each cell gets a little bit more oxygen and can make a little bit more energy. And so body weight has a lot to do with this. And simply losing body weight, mostly fat mass, that's what we're interested in, can increase your VO2 max without doing any training whatsoever. So that means that there are two major ways that you can affect your VO2 max. You can either train to improve your heart and lung capacity, or you can lose weight, particularly fat mass. And of course, the fastest way to do the fastest way to a better VO2 max is to do both of those. Train your heart and lungs, train your cells, train your mitochondria, and lose body fat. Get a better body composition. The problem that most North Americans face is that as they age, they do less and therefore lose heart and lung capacity because it's directly related to activity levels. Plus, they gain fat and they lose muscle over time. And that, my friends, is a recipe for disaster. That means heart and lungs bring in less total oxygen and they have a harder time distributing it across a larger body, sharing less oxygen with more and larger cells. Again, a recipe for disaster. So needless to say, it is critical for you to know what your VO2 max is so you can take the right actions, make the right decisions, so you too can, as I said, die young, as old as possible. And if you're struggling with, gosh, like I've missed the boat, I'm well past my 20s and 30s, and I've not got a history of exercise, and I don't think I can do this, my answer to you is yes, you can. There's a PhD researcher out of the University of Colorado. His name is Inigo San Millan. And he talks about, I think he's an 85-year-old man that he once tested for his VO2 max. And it came back that he had the heart and lung capacity and oxygen energy generating capacity of something like a 35-year-old, like 50 years younger than his chronological age. And San Millan assumed that this guy had been a lifelong endurance athlete. And when he asked him about his past, he expected to hear, yes, I've been a competitive cyclist my whole life, or maybe I was a cross-country skier. And the guy said something like, not even close. And apparently, and I might get some of the details of the story wrong, but, he was somewhere in his 50s. He was very unhealthy. If I remember, he was hypertensive. He was obese. He might have been an alcoholic. I might get that detail wrong, but essentially he had a wake-up call and he decided he was going to quit bad behaviors, and he took up cycling, outdoor cycling, and he was not only able to significantly improve the fitness of his heart and lungs, his oxygen capacity, but to maintain that over decades. And he didn't start until he was somewhere in his 50s. So it's not too late for you. Even if you're in your 70s or 80s listening to this, listen, there are exercise paradigms that medical healthcare uses for people who have had heart attacks, people who have congestive heart failure or cardiac failure. If they can do it, you can do it too. Part of the secret, is to either choose something you love to do that can deliver the results, or choose to love the things that are going to work. You can do it either way. All right. So how do you know where you are? How do you know where you stand and what your VO2 max is right now? Well, again, as I said, you can Google VO2 max testing near me and just simply see what's available and make arrangements to go pay a fee and get your testing done. Or you can use one or both of two tools that I use with my personal coaching, my functional medicine clients. The first is a website run by a group of researchers in Norway. I'll put the link in the episode, but the link is www.worldfitnesslevel.org. That's worldfitnesslevel.org. Again, I'll put it in the description. And if you go to the website, all you have to do is fill out a short questionnaire and they'll calculate this for you. Now, remember, it's an estimate. It's not the same as going into a lab. It's an estimate of the results that you would get if you did a formal test in a lab. But I have it on very good authority from a podcast interview I did with a PhD researcher up in Canada that this particular website, the calculator behind it, is a reasonable way for someone like you and me to estimate where we are right now without having to go to do a formal test. So that's one way, worldfitnesslevel.org. Another way is to do something called the Rockport Mile Test. Again, I'll put a link in the description, but if you simply Google Rockport, like rock is in a stone, Rockport is one word, Rockport Mile Test Calculator, Google that. You'll find descriptions of how to do it. You'll find calculators that you just plug a couple of numbers in. It will spit out a number for you. I'll explain this here in a second. So Rockport Mile Test, and again, I'll put one of several links in the description. But here's how you do the Rockport Mile Test. It's very simple. You can do it outside on a flat surface, or if you have a treadmill indoors, you can get on a treadmill, but make sure you put it at a 1 degree or a 1% elevation. That elevation on the treadmill, the belt will mimic the force that you have to use to propel yourself on the road outside. And there is a difference between walking on a treadmill that has a machine moving the belt versus propelling yourself down the road, for example. So you can do it indoors, you can do it outdoors, doesn't matter. Obviously, do a suitable warm-up, be smart, right? If you have orthopedic issues, don't do it. You might need to check with your doctor, make sure that it's okay. It's my standard CYA stuff. But after a suitable warm-up, assuming that it's okay for you to do this, the goal is to cover a distance of exactly 1 mile as quickly as you can. Exactly 1 mile. And you can walk it as fast as you can. You can walk, jog, whatever your capacity is. But when you're done, you'll need two pieces of information. The first is that you need the time that it took you to cover exactly 1 mile in minutes and seconds. And the second thing is you need to check your heart rate in beats per minute as soon as you're done, right? Don't wait a minute or two because your heart rate will start to go down once you stop doing your exercise. So using something like a smartwatch or a fitness tracker is best. I have an iWatch. That's what I use for all my exercise tracking. If not, if you don't have a fitness tracker, you can do it the old-fashioned way, and you can just use your fingertips, either at your neck or on your wrist, to take your pulse, count that for 30 seconds, and then double it. That will give you the beats per minute. Again, if you don't have a fitness tracker that shows you your heart rate, don't know how to take your pulse, just Google that. It's pretty easy to figure it out. So that's two ways of estimating your VO2 max, using worldfitnesslevel.org or doing the Rockport Mile Test. I like to do both. Sometimes the numbers are a little bit, there's some disparity between the two, because remember, these are just two different ways to make estimates of something that is formally tested using some very sophisticated technology, but these are good enough for people like you and myself. So two different ways to do that. So second question, that's how to figure out where you are. The second question is, what's your goal? Like, what are you shooting for? And I've already said, like, you should be shooting at least for above average for your gender and for your age. So now that you know where you are, you need to know where you're going, right? Here are some basics. But remember, if you Google this, there's all kinds of charts out there on the net that will show you what low is, what above average or superior is for your age and gender. These numbers might vary slightly from source to source. You're just trying to get a goalpost. You're trying to get a marker that you can start to shoot for. First thing I want you to know is that if your VO2 max is 18 or below, this is predictive of loss of independence. In fact, some people say that a VO2 max less than 18 is the line of loss of independence. If you're below that, you're going to need someone to take care of you. You can't take care of yourself. And obviously, this is very serious. And if your score is that low, you need to start making changes right now, assuming that you don't have heart failure or some serious coronary artery disease, which if you do, you need to go back and check with your cardiologist. Having such a low VO2 max basically means that you have no reserve for illness whatsoever. That a serious illness is either going to take you out, or it's going to mean that you have a high chance of complications because you don't have any physiological reserves. This is important. You need to fix that. But let's assume for now that you're not a cardiac patient. Let's assume that you have a VO2 max that's either average or below average, but it's above 18. Remember, the goal is to be at least above average for your age and gender, because you will see at that point a statistically significant reduction in your risk for all-cause mortality. And even though the standards do vary by age and gender, I'm going to offer you a couple of guidelines regardless of those two variables, and I'll give them to you in terms of a minimum and an ideal. So let's go ladies first. So for females, the minimum VO2 max that you want is 30 milliliters per kilogram per minute. 30, minimum of 30. Ideal is 45. If you hit 50, you can get really stoked. 50 is awesome. So for a female, minimum of 30 VO2 max, ideal is 45, and you can high five yourself and everyone around you if your VO2 max is greater than 50. Now, the numbers are a little bit higher for guys simply because the average man, and these are all based on averages, the average man is physically larger, has a larger heart and larger lungs. Therefore, the VO2 max is typically larger in men compared to women. So for men, the minimum VO2 max we want to shoot for is 35. Women, it's 30, men, it's 35. Ideal for a woman is 45. Ideal for a man is 50. You can see the pattern. And if you're a dude and your VO2 max is 55 or higher, high five, right? That's awesome. You can get really stoked and feel really good about that. Doesn't mean you stop, because the moment you stop, you decondition or you're going to lose that. So once you get it, you got to work enough to keep it. It's just like everything else. It takes more work to develop your VO2 max than it does to maintain it, just like it takes more effort to increase your physical strength than it does to maintain a given level of physical strength. All right, I'm watching my time. I'm going to leave it there for this episode. And so far, I've answered 2 of the 3 questions that I posed at the beginning. Let's say 3 of 4 questions. The first one is, what is VO2 max? Why is it important? The second one is, how do you know what your VO2 max is right now? We got 2 different ways to do it. Links in the description. And number 3, where should your VO2 max be? And I want you to think in terms of what's your minimum goal. That's your first goal. Wherever you are, your first goal is to get to the minimum. Once you reach the minimum, your goal is to get to the ideal, right? 30 for women is minimum, 45 is ideal. Men, it's 35 minimum, 50 is ideal. The fourth question, which is how do you get from where you are to where you should be, is going to be the focus of the next episode. I hope you join me again. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Inflammation Nation. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. You can use the links in the episode description to check out Dr. Noseworthy's self-learning programs for thyroid, detox, and gut health. Or you can submit a question for the podcast and even reach out to Dr. Noseworthy directly.